Welcome to True Crime Threads, where we unravel chilling tales of betrayal and deception. Today's story dives into the shocking twist of a murderous husband who made his wife pay for his crimes. Clara and Thomas seemed like the perfect couple, the kind everyone admired from afar. They lived in a beautiful house on a quiet street, tucked away from the chaos of city life. Their neighbors often spoke of how happy they looked, always smiling at each other in public, always the picture of harmony. Clara was a devoted wife, her beauty matched by her kind heart. Thomas, on the other hand, was charming and successful, running a business that was always expanding. They had built a life that appeared to be filled with happiness, success, and stability. Their relationship was strong, or at least that's what Clara believed. They had been married for 5 years, each day seemingly a perfect reflection of the last. Weekends were spent together, whether it was going for walks in the park or enjoying quiet dinners at home. Their routine was comforting, a simple life that Clara cherished. But even the most perfect of facades can begin to crack without warning, and soon Clara began to notice the first signs of trouble. It started subtly. Thomas, who had always been attentive and loving, began coming home later from work. His phone calls became more frequent, but he was careful not to let her overhear the conversations. When they did talk, he was distant, lost in thoughts that Clara couldn't reach. It was nothing major, just little changes that Clara brushed off as stress from work or the pressures of running a business. After all, Thomas had always been hardworking, often putting in long hours to keep the company running smoothly. But as the weeks went on, something felt off. Clara felt a growing unease, an instinctive sense that something was wrong. Yet she couldn't pinpoint what it was. After all, she tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was just a phase. But the feeling persisted. Thomas's late nights became more frequent, and when he was home, he wasn't fully present. His mind seemed to be elsewhere, and Clara began to feel like she was living with a stranger. The conversations they once shared, filled with warmth and laughter, became strained and hollow. She found herself wondering if she had done something wrong, if she had failed him in some way. But no matter how hard she searched for an answer, it remained elusive. One evening, after a particularly long day, Clara came home to find Thomas already there, but his demeanor was different. He was pacing around the living room, his expression tense. He didn't greet her the way he usually did, and there was an unmistakable air of discomfort surrounding him. Clara asked if everything was okay, but Thomas brushed her off with a curt response. He claimed he was just tired from a busy day at work, but Clara noticed the lie in his eyes. He wasn't acting like himself, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That night, as Clara tried to sleep, the sound of Thomas talking on the phone in the study kept her awake. She strained to listen, her curiosity getting the better of her. The words she overheard would change everything. She heard Thomas's voice, low and cold, discussing something that sent a chill down her spine. His words were muffled, but Clara could clearly make out enough to know that he wasn't just talking about business. She heard him mention the deal and getting rid of the problem. Panic surged through her. Was Thomas involved in something dangerous? Had she married a man she didn't truly know? The realization hit her like a punch to the gut, but she tried to dismiss it as paranoia. Still, the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. Something was terribly wrong, and Clara was about to learn just how deep the darkness ran. The following morning, Clara woke up with a sense of dread weighing heavily on her chest. She tried to push away the memory of overhearing Thomas's conversation the night before. But the words lingered in her mind like a haunting echo. Getting rid of the problem. The phrase refused to leave her thoughts, and every time she closed her eyes, she could picture Thomas, her husband, speaking in a tone she had never heard before, cold and calculating. As the day went on, Clara's unease grew. Thomas was acting even more distant than usual. His responses to her questions were short and impersonal, his eyes always focused somewhere else. It was as if he was physically there, but mentally he had already checked out. Clara had spent years with him, and this version of Thomas felt like a stranger. Every time she tried to engage with him, he brushed her off, saying he had too much to do, but Clara could tell that something deeper was at play. She spent the entire day trying to convince herself that she was imagining things, but as the hours passed, her doubts festered into something more sinister. The nagging feeling in her gut refused to be ignored. She couldn't shake the image of Thomas on the phone, speaking in a tone that sent chills down her spine. Who was he talking to? What was he involved in? That night, Clara decided she had to know the truth. She couldn't live in the dark any longer. She had to confront Thomas, no matter how difficult it would be. The house was eerily quiet when she made her way into the study. She found Thomas sitting at his desk, his back to her, staring at his computer screen. He didn't even acknowledge her presence. Clara took a deep breath and walked toward him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Thomas, we need to talk," she said, her voice shaking. Thomas turned around slowly, his expression unreadable. There was a moment of silence, and Clara could see the tension in his jaw. He knew this conversation was coming. "I overheard you last night," Clara continued, her voice gaining strength. "I heard what you said on the phone. You're involved in something dangerous, and I need to know what it is." Thomas's face hardened, and for the first time in a long while, Clara saw a flicker of anger in his eyes. He stood up, his posture rigid. "I don't know what you think you heard, Clara, but you're wrong," he said sharply. "You don't understand." Clara's mind raced. The words she had overheard, the coldness in his voice, it was all too much to ignore. "Don't lie to me, Thomas. I know what I heard. Who were you talking to? What is going on?" For a moment, Thomas was silent, and Clara could see the internal struggle in his eyes. Then he sighed deeply and ran a hand through his hair. "I've been trying to protect you, Clara," he said, his voice low. "But it's too late. You're already involved." Clara felt the floor beneath her feet begin to shift. "Involved? What do you mean?" Thomas turned away from her, staring out the window as if trying to find the right words. "I'm in trouble, Clara. Big trouble. And I didn't want to bring you into it, but it's too late for that now." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. The truth was finally starting to unravel, but it wasn't the truth she had hoped for. Her husband, the man she had trusted, had been living a double life. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She felt dizzy, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what was unfolding before her. Thomas wasn't just distant, he was hiding something monstrous, and Clara was helpless to stop it. She had been living a lie, and the man she loved had become someone unrecognizable. As she stood there, facing her husband, Clara realized that her life would never be the same. The perfect world she had known had shattered, and the nightmare was only beginning. In the days that followed, Clara's life became a blur of confusion and fear. The conversation with Thomas had only deepened her suspicions. She didn't know what to believe anymore. Thomas claimed he was trying to protect her, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized how little she truly knew about him. What had he been involved in? Who had he been talking to? Clara was no longer just worried about his odd behavior. Now, she was terrified of what his secrets might mean for her. It wasn't long before Clara began to notice even more strange occurrences. Thomas would leave the house in the middle of the night, and he didn't return until the early hours of the morning. He had been vague about his whereabouts, often giving her vague one-word answers when she asked where he had been. At first, Clara had been willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, chalking it up to the pressure of his work. But now, each time he came home later than expected, the anxiety in her chest grew heavier. One evening, as she was preparing dinner, Clara noticed something that made her blood run cold. The mail had arrived, and one letter caught her eye. It wasn't addressed to her or Thomas, but to a name she didn't recognize. The envelope was thick, the kind used for legal documents. Clara's curiosity got the better of her, and she opened it. Inside, she found a letter detailing a series of meetings, all marked with dates and times that seemed to overlap with Thomas's absences. The name on the letter was of someone involved in shady business dealings. Clara's stomach dropped as she realized what was going on. Her husband wasn't just working long hours. He was working with people she didn't trust. The unease she had felt for so long now became a full-blown panic. It wasn't until later that week that the nightmare truly began to unfold. Clara came home to find a blood-soaked note left on the kitchen table. She stood frozen for a moment, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. The letter had no signature, only the chilling words, "He's gone." Clara's mind raced. Who was gone? And what did this have to do with Thomas? Her heart pounded as she quickly tried to call him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. The fear she had been pushing down for weeks began to claw its way to the surface. Desperate for answers, Clara called the police. She didn't know who to trust anymore, but something told her that the authorities needed to know about the note. They arrived quickly, but the situation only grew more bizarre. The officers searched the house and questioned Clara, but there were no immediate answers. They couldn't confirm if a crime had even been committed, and Thomas was still unreachable. But they did tell Clara something that sent a chill down her spine. A body had been discovered nearby, and it was linked to an investigation involving Thomas's business dealings. Clara's blood ran cold. Her worst fears had been confirmed. Her husband was involved in something far darker than she could have ever imagined. As the days passed, Clara tried to hold it together, but the fear never left her. Every time the doorbell rang or the phone rang, her heart skipped a beat. Was Thomas dead? Had he really been murdered? Or had he been the one to commit the crime? Clara was stuck in a nightmare of uncertainty, unable to escape. She couldn't go back to the life she had before, and every corner she turned only seemed to reveal more lies. The person she had married, the man she had loved, was no longer the same man. The question that haunted her was not just about what Thomas had done, but what he had dragged her into. She didn't know how to escape this nightmare, but the walls were closing in on her, and she feared it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The weeks following the discovery of the body were a blur of police visits, unanswered questions, and growing dread. Clara couldn't escape the feeling that she was being pulled deeper into something monstrous, a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Each day felt longer than the last as she waited for Thomas to return, for the truth to surface, but nothing happened. No word from him, no clear answers from the police. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. And yet every time Clara thought she could breathe, another revelation sent her spiraling further into a sea of terror. Then, one day, the unimaginable happened. The police arrived at her door, this time with a warrant for her arrest. They believed Clara was somehow involved in the murder, despite the fact that she had no knowledge of the crime. Her heart stopped when they placed her in handcuffs. It felt like the world was crashing down around her. She protested, pleading that she had nothing to do with it, But they didn't listen. The evidence they presented was circumstantial, but it was enough for them to take her in. As Clara sat in the interrogation room, her mind raced. She tried to remember every detail, every interaction with Thomas, every moment that could give her any clue as to what was really going on. She recalled his increasing distance, his late nights, his secretive behavior. She couldn't fathom that the man she had loved and trusted could be capable of such horror. But the mounting evidence told a different story. The police had discovered that Thomas had been involved in a series of illegal dealings, all tied to the murder. The victim had been someone Thomas knew well, a business associate of his who had gotten too close to the truth. The walls seemed to close in on Clara, and she found herself grappling with the realization that Thomas had been living a double life, a life she had never known about. He had been using her as a cover, keeping up the appearance of a perfect, happy couple while secretly running a criminal empire. She had been blind to it all, trapped in a lie she hadn't even realized she was living. Days passed, and the police continued their investigation. But Clara was growing desperate for any answers. She felt like a pawn in a game she didn't understand. Her entire life had been built on a foundation of lies, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep up the facade of innocence. She tried to contact Thomas, but his phone was still off and he was nowhere to be found. Then, the moment of truth arrived. Clara was sitting alone in her apartment, the weight of everything pressing down on her shoulders when the phone rang. It was the detective, and his voice was cold as he delivered the news. Thomas had been arrested. He was alive, but he had been hiding. The authorities had discovered that he had orchestrated the murder, not only to eliminate the victim, but also to silence anyone who might have been a threat to his criminal operations. It turned out that the victim had known too much, and Thomas had taken drastic measures to keep him quiet. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. As the detective spoke, Clara's world tilted on its axis. Thomas hadn't just been involved in the murder, he had set her up to take the fall. He had planted evidence, left the blood-soaked note behind, and made sure she would be the one who appeared guilty. Thomas had been preparing to frame her all along, using her as a pawn to cover his tracks. The betrayal hit Clara like a physical blow. She had married a man who had never cared for her, never truly loved her. She had been a means to an end, a way for Thomas to keep his secrets hidden. The truth was finally coming to light, but the damage had already been done. Clara was no longer just a victim of her husband's actions. She was a pawn in his elaborate scheme to protect himself. The man she had married, the man she thought she knew, was a stranger who had used her as a shield for his crimes. And now, Clara was left to pick up the pieces of a life that had been shattered beyond repair. Clara's world was in ruins. After everything had been uncovered, she felt a sense of disbelief, like she was watching a tragedy unfold in slow motion, unable to stop it. Thomas, the man she had trusted and loved, had orchestrated not only the murder, but also an elaborate plan to destroy her. The realization that he had been framing her from the beginning was something she couldn't quite comprehend. Her mind couldn't wrap around the depth of his betrayal. Days passed in a haze of court hearings, police interviews, and public humiliation. Clara had no choice but to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. The evidence against her was mounting, and her life had become an open book for everyone to see. She had no alibi for the night of the murder, no way to explain how her fingerprints had ended up on the note. The fact that she had been so completely blindsided by Thomas's actions made everything worse. She couldn't defend herself against accusations that had no basis in truth, but the system didn't seem to care about her innocence. The police had their suspect, and that was all that mattered. Through it all, Clara's thoughts remained fixated on Thomas. Where was he? Had he been arrested? Or was he still hiding somewhere, slipping through the cracks of the system? She tried to hold on to the idea that maybe, just maybe, he was still out there, trying to fix everything. But deep down, Clara knew the truth. He was never going to come back. He had left her to take the fall, and there was no redemption in his heart. One afternoon, as Clara sat in her apartment, she received an unexpected visit. The detective who had been investigating Thomas's case came to speak with her. His expression was grim as he delivered the news. Thomas had been found, but he wasn't in custody. The authorities had discovered that he had taken his own life, unable to face the consequences of his actions. The news hit Clara like a punch to the stomach. She felt numb, unable to process what she had just heard. Thomas, the man who had ruined her life, was gone. But instead of relief, Clara felt an overwhelming sense of emptiness. His death didn't undo the damage he had caused. It didn't erase the lies, the manipulation, or the years of deception. His absence didn't bring back the life she had lost. The detective explained that Thomas's death had cleared Clara of any suspicion in the murder. With Thomas gone, there was no one left to accuse her, no one left to frame her. The police had found enough evidence to prove she wasn't involved. But that knowledge brought Clara no comfort. The damage was already done. Her reputation had been destroyed, her marriage had been a lie, and the man she had spent years loving had betrayed her in the most unforgivable way. Clara left the courthouse feeling like a hollow shell of the person she used to be. Her life was unrecognizable. The once beautiful home she had shared with Thomas was now a haunting reminder of everything she had lost. The friends she thought she had, the life she had built, all of it was gone. She had been left with nothing but the weight of the truth and the knowledge that her trust had been shattered beyond repair. In the end, Clara was left to pick up the pieces of her life, but it wasn't easy. She couldn't forget what Thomas had done to her, how he had manipulated her, how he had used her to hide his dark secrets. The pain of betrayal never truly went away, and Clara knew that it would take years to heal from the scars that would forever mark her soul. But she was determined to move on, to rebuild her life and find herself again. That was the story of how Clara made her way to freedom. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but Clara had no other choice. She would survive, and one day she would learn to trust again. But that would take time, and the journey toward healing was only just beginning.